And we're live. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Blasters and Blades podcast. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. John McNichol, introduce himself. So can you tell the listeners and viewers who you are?
Absolutely. And thanks again, JR, for having me here. I'm having a great time already. For those who don't know me, my name is John McNichol. I'm 52 years old. Originally, I'm from Toronto, Canada, and I was born at the dawn of the swinging 70s. And that probably explains why I'm such a big fan of the big 80s. Originally, I said I was from Toronto, and I spent the first 18 years of my life there. I ended up going to college down in the States, met my wife, and then when I graduated from college in 92, we moved up to the Pacific Northwest, and we were there for about 25 years and somehow had 7 children.
You got stuff to do.
Oh, gosh, yeah, that's true. People ask me, how do you have time to read books? I say sleep is for wimps, and I keep doing my thing. But I only partially joke now and say back about 2016, we escaped from Portland. And now we live down in Texas, and I love it down here. People are great. The heat is awful, but that's about the only thing I would change about life down here if I could. But everything else has been grand. My wife is doing well here, too. My kids love their schools, so keep the fingers crossed that everything keeps on going well. And yeah, I've been able to write a number of books on the side, so it's been good too.
Do you ever throw in an occasional just to make them know you're Canadian?
I do that, but the weird thing is it doesn't really pop up until I talk to friends who are from Canada, and then my wife goes nuts because then I'll also have all the other pronunciations, like I'll say Tuesday instead of Tuesday and stuff like that. So it all comes out. So okay.
So do you ever have the occasional craving for Timmy Hortons?
Tim Hortons kind of got big started after I was gone, but
okay.
I do. If anybody ever wants to do me a solid, I totally miss this one hamburger chain that is only in Canada called Harvey's. I would just crave Harvey's burgers still. 10 years since I've visited home, I still want those Harvey's burgers. But yeah, there's that and poutine. I love poutine. That's me.
That's the one with cheese curds on fries?
Yes, I saw poutine. You're probably a gamer if you as well, or at least familiar enough with gaming lore. Poutine is French fries with cheese on top, hot gravy over that, and I've seen some purists who will take a squeezed packet of ketchup and a squeezed packet of white vinegar. We have that in Canada in the McDonald's. And they'll just do a double shot of that over it. It's a TPK for your heart. It's a total party kill. I mean, you just smell the stuff and you can hear your artery snapping shut all the way down if you've done it right. It's good.
So I did some training at the Vermont National Guard base.
Oh.
It's pretty close to the border to you. I think it's close to Quebec. I don't know. I'm not familiar with Canadian geography. So whatever's right above Vermont, we did some training up there. And those mountains were no joke.
Yeah, I don't really, to be honest, I don't know what borders on Quebec anyway either, because I'm from Ontario and we joke and say we hate the French. Every couple of years, Quebec votes whether or not they're just going to leave Canada. And a lot of English Canada says just go. You'll be back, but just go for now. Quit whining about everything. But they always stick around by about half a percentage point. So yeah, you haven't missed much. I say that, of course, my dad is from Quebec. I can tell you're English because you say Quebec instead of Quebec, the way a lot of us were encouraged to say. So it's okay.
Yeah, I speak English and not always very well. I took German first I started with Spanish in high school, and the teacher was so poor at classroom management that I was just not where we needed to be. And so when I started the third year and I was actually expected to understand things, I realized it was too little too late. So I'm like, well, I'll start a new language, because you either had to do 3 of one or 2 of 2 different languages.
Oh boy.
And I switched to German, and that's a lot easier. You just have to sound very angry and like you want to spit on somebody and then talk. It worked out perfectly. I don't know if they're as angry as they sound, but it definitely helped me fake the funk for college and high school. So I didn't have to worry about it. Oh, and I speak the international language of love, sometimes called M16.
It's the
rifle. M16, the rifle.
Oh,
That's the international language I love.
That's funny. No, in French, I just basically waved a white flag every now and again. And I think that's why they passed me. So, I mean, you get through it however.
I shouldn't be laughing.
You should. You should. I mean, hey, I'm a quarter French. I can make fun of them as much as I want. I'm not offended. I'm Gen X. It's hard to offend me. It's really hard to offend.
Yeah, we grew up on Beavis and Butthead and
exactly
all that.
Grew up with Beavis and Butthead.
The most irreverent group of people.
All of it. Yeah, all of it.
But yeah, see, we didn't really deal with the French, although a couple of years ago, there a couple articles came out about, the joke about surrender monkeys with the French. And they're like, no, the modern French army isn't like that. And there was like a whole PR campaign.
Of course.
I just remember when I was in Iraq, they told us it was about winning the hearts and minds at year 3 of the war. And my platoon sergeant's a crusty old Southern guy. And he's like, just grab them by the balls and the hearts will follow. And so that's when he told me we spoke the language of love with the M16.
Actually, I think that is a twisting of a quote by, LBJ. He said, if I have them by the, and I apologize to anybody who is scandalized by my phraseology here, but LBJ apparently said, if I've got them by the short and curlies, then the hearts and minds will always follow. So that works out real good.
He was old enough that actually fits.
There you go.
He had served in Vietnam for 3 tours. Got out and he hit that mark. He got out and he hit that mark where everyone's like, if I just stuck in, I'd be retiring right now. And so he enlisted in the Guard.
Oh, okay.
And so that's how in early war in 2004, we had a 3-time Vietnam vet as my platoon sergeant.
Oh, man, that's awesome. That's really cool. For a second, I thought you were saying LBJ was said served 3 terms. I'm kind of like, what? Okay. There we go.
No. He would have been alive when LBJ would have said that.
Wokian slip. So there we go.
Yeah, he would have been alive to hear it, so it makes sense that he would paraphrase that. But all right, so let's get back on the interview. We've already gone far afield. I can already tell I'm going to like you. So the next part of the introduction, dear listener, is how we found them. And I'm not totally sure, but I'm pretty confident that he was one of the ones Declan Fenn sent us. Yep. He sent us a decent number of authors across the spectrum, so it was Break Up the Monotony. The problem is once you get a podcast and you're on year 3 of this, and with the sci-fi side, year 5, you've already interviewed everyone and so you can either get really nepotistic and just keep interviewing them, or you have to branch out. And so Declan's been trying to help us find people we wouldn't otherwise known in our circles, because he's a little bit all over the place with his writing.
Oh, so you're not just scraping the bottom of the barrel talking to me. Okay, I feel better.
I mean, maybe Declan was, but that's not how I found you, sir.
I know.
All right, sir, but before we let this interview continue, I have to ask the religion question. Are you ready for this?
Oh, yes, 100%.
Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, here's my answer. I like Star Wars for the message. I like Star Trek for the preaching, so it's not too intense. And I like Firefly for the one-liners, scriptures, if you want it like that. So there we go. And they've got a seriously kick-butt board game. Firefly does. That's what I like.
There's a board game for Firefly?
You did not know this? Oh, man. I did not.
Yeah. What is it? What's it like? Is it like a card game? Is it an actual board game?
It's a board game, but you use cards. You have a poker hand. You try to misbehave. You try to heist stuff. It's great. I mean, if you've got people who know the Firefly lore, and you've got about 5 hours to kill, it's a ball. And my family loved it. I'm the only real gamer in my family, but even my kids who aren't 100% gamer like doing it.
Are you more or less likely to destroy a family with this game than you would with, say, Settlers of Catan?
I think Settlers of Catan has been the subject of far more fights in my family. I have one son, one of my 4 sons. He's that kid who's incredibly competitive and was cheering how he had won like 15 straight victories. And so, of course, when we were building everything, I and his other brothers, what are we supposed to do? We all ganged up and cut him off. And he got upset and quit and said, I'm done. I'm like, okay, that breaks your streak. That doesn't count. And of course, it's one of those family arguments that gets all heated and stuff like that. And then 10 minutes later, it's like, oh, cool, Star Wars is on. Let's do. We do something else. So, but yeah, Catan is the source of a lot more family strife than the Firefly was.
some of those that are the gifts that keep on giving because you still talk about it.
Yeah.
My stepdad and I went to a Boy Scout camp,
Mhm.
and we had the rifle marksmanship, and I came in second. I lost to a Russian exchange student who complained that he wanted to go again because he got 99 out of 100, and I came in
Oh,
second with 95
one of those.
points. He's one of those, and I'm
Yeah.
just like, dude, take the win and go, right? Like I was pretty pleased with 95 out of 100,
Uh-huh.
and I don't even remember how they scored it. Just that was the final score.
Mhm.
And so because I was riding so high and so sure of myself because I'd come in second out of the camp when we did the archery, I'm like, I bet I could hit a bullseye to my stepdad. He's
Oh,
like, I'll
no.
bet you $5 that you can't hit a bullseye. So I pull back, I let it go, and I hit a bullseye. 3 rows over and 4 rows back from the one I was aiming at, but I still hit a bullseye. And so he has not settled that debt because he swears it doesn't count because the implication was my bullseye, where
Yeah.
I would argue that the rules never specified which bullseye, and we still argue about that on occasion just for the fun of it.
Okay, I've got one better for you. When I was in the archery
So
club in grade 9, we had an archery club, and one fellow said, "I'll bet you $10." My friend Dan Chittenden said, "I'll bet you 10. I'll bet you $10 I can shoot the bullseye." I said, "If you get a bullseye, I'll give you a 20." And he did get the bullseye. But I pulled out. I had a $20 bill of some obscure East Asian piece that was like worth about 10 cents, and he's like, "I said A20. I said A20." I
I
think
like
he's
it.
still kind of mad at me about that. We still bounce that back and forth now and again on the alumni website. But that's me.
And that would have been worth a lot more back then if it was a real 20.
Probably. Well, it was a Canadian 20, so that plus 50 cents will probably get you a Coke. But who knows?
Well, I mean, even if that's true now, it would have been worth more then. Maybe you could have gotten 2 Cokes.
Yeah, you're right. There you go.
So, all right. So, on with the second part of the religion question, because we're polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast.
Sure.
Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Conan the Barbarian?
Okay, well, I'm going to try and not beat around the bush too much here. Definitely Conan the Barbarian. And not just because I'm a child of the 80s and Arnold was everything, during that decade, but also because of the pretty blonde gal who was his love interest who died halfway through the movie. Don't remember her name, but she was just the pretty blonde chick. But also because I've never seen Game of Thrones, quite frankly. I know some people might get mad at this characterization, but with the number of children we have and the number of things I've got, I honestly didn't have the time to invest watching a miniseries, especially when my daughter said, "Oh, it's basically just Lord of the Rings with naked people." Okay. Moral issues aside, I don't have time to invest in another Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure not going with the Amazon one or any of the other ones. So yeah, definitely Conan. Wheel of Time, it's one of those. Robert Jordan, I like his stuff, but I've never gotten into Wheel of Time. And my understanding is, again, the miniseries left a lot to be desired among the fan base. Would that be accurate?
I've seen it, but I haven't read his books.
Okay.
So I don't know how it compares. When I watched the first episode, I just remember thinking, do they hate all men because the way the universe was?
Mm-hmm.
And then I called a friend of mine, Jesse, and I was asking him about it because I know he was a huge fan. He read all the books. He's like, no, they just crapped out on all the lore. So as a standalone generic fantasy, it was okay. I didn't hate it, didn't love it, nothing special. The armor was crap. They needed someone who understood period history to try to make it look realistic. I don't know where, after having watched Lord of the Rings, the movies, and seen what it can look like seeing this was like, how is 10 years later we got worse?
Yep.
Right. But it wasn't horrible. The people that knew the lore, though, were very upset.
Yeah, that's what I said. So.
I have a rule that if the property is out in book and movie, I try to watch whatever or read whatever was first, and then I'll do the other venue, because that's more authentic to the vision of the creator, and it just helps me enjoy it better. So if the movie was first, I'll watch the movie, then I'll read the book. If the book was first, I'll read the book, and then watch the movie. But I also have a policy against starting books I know I'll never get an ending for, because it'll just drive my little OCD brain bonkers.
Oh, sure.
And so unfortunately, Game of Thrones, the Grimdark, which I don't generally read anyway, I just don't know that anyone's ever going to get an ending for that.
Yeah, he's been like 20 years waiting on the last book. I mean, I can't really judge because I've been like 10 years getting the third one in my series. But yeah, I've heard it's been a long time. No one's gotten an end to the actual series yet.
And he's not writing that now. He's writing like prequel stuff. I think he wrote himself into a corner.
Okay.
My guess. I don't know. I haven't read it. I just heard people talking about it. Either way, I can't start a series that I know I'll never get an in for.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me too. I wouldn't do
So,
it. That's me.
but I mean, I don't hate it. I know lots of people who love the Grimdark, so I mean, I've got no problem with it. There's a podcast, and if you guys, dear listener, haven't listened to it, it's called the Angry Staff Officer, and it's basically military officers that then analyze movies on their podcast for the
Mhm.
tactics. So they like broke down all the strategic blunders of Rogue One for Star Wars. They did a bunch on the various battles for Game of Thrones, and they just like talk about all the mistakes in logistics that they made that would have meant that could have never happened, or if that's what happened, why it was wrong. And
Yep.
so some of the breakdowns of the combat they did were hilarious. So if you haven't
Well,
found them on the podcast platforms, you guys should check them out.
I think I will. Yeah. What is the staff
It's
sergeant?
the Angry Staff Officer. So they're
Angry-
all like majors.
Okay.
It's the when officers go out of company level field command
Okay.
and they have to go to a desk job. So all of them are angry because they went from
Oh, I
doing
get it
cool
now.
stuff to paperwork.
That's
So the
very
joke was the staff officers were always upset. So they named their podcast the Angry Staff Officer.
You see, if they do tactics, I'd hate to see what they'd say of Conan because the basic plot of almost every Conan novel, one way or another, Conan gets dropped in the middle of an army and he wipes them all out. The end. So it's just like
I don't know that they would go that far back to the classics. I mean, I haven't heard them do one, but I don't know they wouldn't. But yeah, that's kind of a tropish, a product of its time, shall we say?
Sure, definitely. But I did enjoy it. I did enjoy it.
Yeah, it was good. And Red Sonja that came after, I think, was a good one.
Well, the
So
movie itself, terrible. But again, I remember I was a teenage boy reading the comic books, and Red Sonja had the fabled chainmail bikini. So I mean, realism, schmealism. She's beautiful. drop $2
yeah,
in the book, that kind of thing.
and now all of the comedy skit channels do the joke about the this chainmail bikini, and somehow they get the same protection as the guy in full plate.
Well, yeah, and actually, I did see an RPG once because I am a gamer. I'll admit it, I love GMing, but I did see an RPG once where they actually gave the same level of protection to a chainmail bikini as they did plate mail, and the argument was it's so distracting to the person who's trying to hit this poor young lady that they end up keep on missing and just hitting all the metal parts on it. So there you go. It's a
That works.
justification.
So
Not realistic at all, but justification. It's there. Hey, it's fantasy. Roll with it, I guess.
so what's your game system of choice?
Me, well, if there is such a thing as adult ADD, I've got it in spades. And so I prefer me. I love a game engine called Savage Worlds. It's great
Okay.
for storytelling. Yeah, it's great for storytelling. It's got a minimum of number crunching. And for me, the best part when we're trying to figure out initiative and combat, you get the fabled deck of playing cards and you just deal them out and boom. And combat that would take 6 hours in a Dungeons and Dragons game takes about 6 minutes if you're doing Savage Worlds. So that's me, and I'll do Savage. I've done Savage Worlds, Star Wars, and medieval, D&D type stuff. Right now, I've got a steampunk Justice League of America campaign that I'm having a ball doing with the folks in my area. So it's good.
Do you do most of that in person locally, or are you using like some sort of online system?
I have to admit, except for one group that I still am connected to in the Pacific Northwest, a group of dear friends who are very good and a lot of fun to game with. They're the only ones I do online gaming with now. I did GM an online game system for a while during the pandemic for a friend who kind of wanted to get his kids together. And that was fun. But for me, I'm just the kind of person, I love the immediacy of everybody around. We're rolling dice. You can hear them clatter on the table, and people make a joke, and you could actually have the person right at your elbow laughing. That's just me. I enjoy the in-person gaming style much more so than the Zoom call style. But that's just me.
Do you use the minis and such when you play at your table, or is it theater of the mind?
Oh yeah, I love minis. I've actually graduated recently from. I love painting them. And I graduated recently from scrolling through and looking for the perfect mini to somebody introduced me to a couple of sites, Hero Forge and Eldritch Foundry, where you can design your own miniatures and then you download them. And one of my very, very generous children who gave me a small, compact 3D printer. So I've got it printing out some pillars right now for a game I'm running on Saturday for the scenery. So yeah, it's been good. It's been good.
Cool. I like it. I like it. We've actually talked about doing a small side podcast just about gaming stuff
Oh, cool.
because I came to it late in life in a Navy town. I was busy with girls and sports, and I didn't really have any. Like, I didn't know anybody playing D&D. You heard about it,
Sure.
and then once I was old enough to look out more proactively, everyone was getting transferred here and there, so it's just hard to get a table together. So I didn't start playing until I think late 20 teens.
Oh, okay. Not too
So
bad.
2016 to 2017, I think. So I'm still learning.
Yeah, I started when I was about 12 or 13 because you're talking about the novel versus the book versus the movie, rather. I read in the novelized version of E.T. I didn't realize in the movie they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, but they get into more detail in the novelized version of E.T. I asked my mom for a set. It was 1983. I was making new friends. And then the fabled satanic panic hit, and there were about 24 murders of people nationwide with nothing connecting them except Dungeons and Dragons. So that hobby had to go out the window until I got to college. But no, I totally get it when you have to wait until you're in your 20s to start like that. I didn't really get into miniatures or miniature. I also do miniature wargaming, but I didn't start doing that with my sons until about my mid 30s. So yeah, it's sometimes better to get into it later in life.
Yeah, I got lucky because I started through the writing. So I did a few games with my local writing group.
Oh, cool.
That didn't pan out, mostly other reasons. And then I didn't play again. That was 2016. I didn't play again until I think 2018 or 19,
Mhm.
when the old school sci-fi writers playing old school D&D started, and I had the privilege of playing several games with James Ward, who was one of the TSR OGs. So it was
Yeah,
kind of cool
yeah.
to hear the stories from when it was original, even though I wasn't. I mean, I was alive, but I wasn't there.
Mhm.
So that was kind of cool. But I suppose we should get back on track, or this is going to be a 2-hour episode.
Sorry, I yacked too
No,
much.
no, no. You're absolutely. This is what happens when I don't have a co-host to rein me in. So we here at the Blasters and Blades love both the fantastical and the scientific. But what was your first love, sci-fi or fantasy?
Boy, that's a good question. I would say they've kind of both at the same time, and here's why. Uh, my mom was a single parent for a good chunk of my growing up years until she met my dad, the man I call my dad. He's my stepfather, but I call him my dad they got married when I was 13. But prior to that, a nice fellow was hitting on my mom, and he was a fantasy and science fiction fan. So he gave me my first science fiction anthology. It was a collection of Isaac Asimov's Analog. And I still remember the first story in there. It's called Gift of a Useless Man, and by Alan Dean Foster. So that got me into science fiction. But he also gave me my real kind of introduction to the fantasy world, which was a solitaire game. I had no idea of micro games or anything like that. It was a solitaire game in a little box about yay big by yay big called Barbarian Prince. And you moved a little figurine around the map, and you had a little booklet that showed you all these pre-programmed sequences and what are your decisions, roll the dice, flip to this page. So I kind of got both of them at the same time. I mean, I was 7 years old when Star Wars came out, and I kind of put that in both science fiction and fantasy. I mean, realistically, you've got one kid, one 20-year-old kid with a glowing sword. He goes up against 100 guys with blasters, and he's going to win. That's pure fantasy to me. But yeah, I love them both. They've both got aspects that are intriguing to me. The science fiction, either the soft or the hard, and fantasy, either high or quote unquote low, where it's a whole lot of mishmash. I liked it all, from the time I was about 12 years on.
Okay,
So
that's a thorough answer.
hope that works.
Yeah, no, it's a good answer. So okay, do you remember what your first memory of engaging in speculative fiction was? Was it games, movies, books? Like, how did you discover the umbrella that includes fantasy and sci-fi?
Oh, well, probably when I read that first story I told you about, Gift of a Useless Man by Alan Dean Foster. And again, up until I was 12, most of the stuff I'd read were kind of, teen sleuth type books. Group of little kids all get together and solve a mystery, kind of like Scooby Doo. Or if you're old enough to remember a Saturday morning TV show called The Red Hand Gang, or another one called The Bloodhound Gang. That's pretty much the main stuff that was available to kids in my age group at that time. But when I ended up reading Gift of a Useless Man, it was the first. I said in a different interview, most of us remember our first kiss, our first car, our first job. Okay. For me, I remember that story almost word for word to this day, because it was about a fellow who was a low level criminal, got thrown from his spaceship in a crash. He's paralyzed. He's expecting to starve to death and die, but slowly a little group of telepathic insects end up befriending him, and through basically everything from the dead skin from his scalp to the wastes from his body. He teaches these guys all he knows, which isn't much, about farming and civilization and all that. And so this useless man ends up being the pivotal civilization point of cultural relevance for these millions upon millions of intelligent insect-like creatures. And so to me, I won't say it blew my mind, but I remembered just kind of going through the next day. I didn't really understand why I felt almost intoxicated reading this, but it's because this was a kind of story I had never been exposed to before. And it was at a level of complexity with themes I had never been exposed to before. And like most people, when they encounter something that has that kind of effect on them, you want more.
More. Yeah.
So that's what I started looking for. Unfortunately, again, I had members of my family whose attitude was, well, this kind of writing opposes our values, and they weren't wrong that a lot of the authors did during that time period oppose the values that my folks were probably trying to instill in me. I'm happy to say that if that was the case, well, I still got the values I do. But I ended up reading a fair bit of science fiction. I watched Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan when I went on a ski trip with the Royal Canadian Air Cadets. I'm not really military, but hey, it was good for me. So I basically just kind of did catch as catch can. And later on, when more what's what I'm looking for, more deep uh, types of science fiction came out, Blade Runner, that was a film I found myself just watching again and again on videotape when I could, because a new little theme would pop up again and again. When E.T. came out, when I was just about to turn 13, again, all these images were just total revelations to me. So yeah, that's kind of, I would say, the point when I read that first book, that first story by Alan Dean Foster, that it kind of was the gateway for me. And the nice thing was, I'm a teacher by trade. When I got to teach my middle schoolers Gulliver's Travels, and we did the story of Lilliput, where Gulliver is tied up by all these tiny little beings, and they are completely unwise and don't listen to them. Well, they don't listen to Gulliver, rather. Well, I was able to take the last 5 minutes of every class period and read them a little bit more of the story of Gift of a Useless Man, and they were enthralled by it. And I found Alan Dean Foster's email and just quick told him, this is what your story meant to me, and now I'm sharing it with my students. And he popped an answer back to me within about 10 minutes saying, thank you so much, because that means more to me than a whole box full of plastic awards. So yeah, that kind of brought things full circle. I actually got to talk to the author. I got to talk to the guy who made the story that pointed me in a really enthralling direction. So that was neat for me.
So what is it about speculative fiction that you love so much?
Wow. Well, as I said, I'm a teacher, and I'm the teacher who likes to tell stories to get a point across. And for speculative fiction, if you want to teach a lesson, you can do it so much easier by telling an enthralling story than by simply saying you should defer gratification to do something great. Okay. Well, hey, we all know the story of the three little pigs when we were growing up, and that's what that story is basically about. Great way to teach the lesson. Speculative fiction, when it's done well, okay, it taps into themes that are kind of universal to all of us. The hero's journey. You start up here in your normal life, you're called out of it, you end up going on a journey, you get to your low point, and you fight your way to the upper bit. You've got friends to help you and all that. These are things that all people can identify with, regardless of their culture, their time period. whatever, man, woman, American, Lower Slobovia, whatever. And that's what I love about speculative fiction when it's done well. It may have a message, but first and foremost, it tells a great story, the kind of story that a person from any particular walk of life could really enjoy. That's what I like, the universality of it and its ability to teach something while telling, while enjoying, while causing enjoyment, while enthralling the people who are hearing it. Hope that doesn't sound too pretentious, but that's just me.
No, I mean, the good thing about speculative fiction, and sometimes fantasy, is you can explore those ideas in a way that's not offensive for anybody and just think about them and the implications,
Right.
and if you have this technology, okay, well then what? So I mean, yeah, I get that. So how did your love of speculative fiction transition into you deciding to tell your own stories?
Wow, that's a good one. Okay, I know, like I said, I've been running off the mouth myself a bit, but I'll try and keep this one quick. When uh, I was teaching a middle school class that I really enjoyed, and I knew I was going to actually enjoy a class when the other teachers in my school said, "Oh no, you've got them." Okay, well, them usually means that they're right for somebody who can actually get stuff across in a fun way to them, and that's what I've always been all about. And when I got this group's first batch of book reports, it was interesting to me because uh, a lot of these book reports, the plots of their novels, again, I'll admit I liked ones that were offbeat, but these just seemed almost creepy in some ways. I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but the plots seemed to have the wrong, basically just reprehensible individuals in many cases as the protagonists, and it almost seemed to glorify more actions that even a person who isn't religious would see as immoral or just plain wrong to do. And it was shown as cool, kind of like when Beavis and Butthead, they say fire is cool. You remember that kind of thing. We
I do.
laughed. Yeah, we laughed, but we laughed because we know these guys were awful and we know that we would never do something like that. We understood that these young people, I could see that their choices of reading were actually really affecting how they saw the world and how they were interacting with each other. Also, people who were of a more ethical bent in a lot of the stories I was seeing, they were portrayed almost as the villains, if anything. Their defenses of their belief systems were always simplistic and easily knocked down by the protagonists, who, again, not good people, not nice people, not anybody you'd really want to hang out with, certainly no one you'd trust with your money or your daughter. And so I thought, I could do better than this. I've got stories in my head that are better than this. When my radio broke in my car and I couldn't afford to fix it, I found myself just doing all kinds of stories as I was going in the car back and forth, like I used to do when I walked to school back and forth when I was a kid. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but back in my day, you know.
I mean, we had kids that walked to school. I just always lived farther away.
Oh, okay, okay. So you took the bus. That's fine. No, I joke and say back in my day, we walked to school, we went home for lunch, and our video game systems had one button and one joystick, and we liked it. So there. But,
So we didn't have the walk home for lunch as an option,
okay,
and people did walk. We were probably the last of the latchkey generation.
yeah, there you
You
go.
come
There
home
you
to an empty house where your parents were at work. Yeah, so I
go.
get it.
That was me. That was me. So I started looking, and I realized, wouldn't it be cool? What would I like these guys to read more of? And at the time, there was an author who had been kind of pushed out of the canon because he was not uh, part of the cultural ethos, but he actually predicted things like uh, the rise of eugenics, the role of the Germans, angry people, what they were going to be doing. He was saying this at the turn of the century. His name was Gilbert Keith Chesterton, or just G.K. Chesterton for short. Very moral individual, atheist to begin with, ended up converting to general Christianity, and towards the end of his life to Roman Catholicism. But he wrote 100 novels and published 1,000 poems, and he was just an incredible writer, great at turn of the phrase. Weighed like about 350 pounds when he was an adult, but he was like, I don't know, 6'5" and 50 pounds when he was a kid. It was kind of crazy just how he changed over time. But the really weird part for me was he was best friends with guys like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, men who were his complete opposites in terms of. I'm just going to take my glasses off here for a second because it looks like my eyes are shining back kind of at me all the time. Guys were the complete opposite of Mr. Chesterton in terms of moral, theological, or ethical outlooks. And he maintained warm friendships with these guys, even though they were the complete opposite of one another. And that was a lot like a number of the friendships I had in high school as well, I'm happy to say. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you had a story about a teenaged G.K. Chesterton? And one of his characters in his novels was a mystery solving priest. Put him in as the mentor. Bring in a teenaged H.G. Wells. And now they've got to try and fight the tripods as they land from Mars. I was worried at first that maybe I might get sued because obviously these characters aren't mine. But happiness, it turns out that the copyright runs out in America after 100 years. So I was safe. But still, it was a wonderful piece to write. And then that book that I first started, we were snowed in like we are tonight in Texas, where I live now. But we were snowed in Washington State for about a week. And I sat down and I started writing the book. And it took about 5 years from the time I first sat down on my old beat up laptop to when I actually held the cover in my hands. I held the book with everything in my hands. But it's been totally worth it. I had a great time with it, and it's been a good journey so far. And I've got the sequel out, the Emperor of North America, and I'm down to the final edits of the third book in the series called Where the Red Sands Fly. So yeah, that's where that came from.
Okay.
Yeah.
So many authors will let their own real life experiences influence the sort of stories they tell. So were there any specific formidable moments that you feel like shaped you as a storyteller?
Oh yeah, big time. I didn't really realize this. This is kind of funny. When you're writing, sometimes you don't really realize that your own stuff is getting in there. You just know that this sounds cool right now, and this turns my crank while I'm saying it. When you go back and you look over your first draft, you kind of realize, wow, this is where this came from. Short version, again, my mom was a single parent. From the time I was 7 until I was 13, we lived in a section of Toronto called Little Italy. And you can imagine what that would have been like if your last name was McNichol. He was a running gag in the class. I heard one fellow say, yeah, if your name did not end in a vowel in our neighborhood, you were at a serious social disadvantage. I do a little stand up on the side out here, and I say, yeah, it was always fun when they called the roll in the morning. Luigi Abaldi, Nick Ruggiero, Sierra Alfonso, John McNichol. Get a load of the guy. So I got bullied. I got beaten up a fair bit. In Toronto, a non-Italian European like me, they're called mangiachecs and cake eaters. They don't eat meat, they eat fluffy cake. So I got bullied a fair bit. And I think that may be one reason why Chesterton, one of the things he really brought attention to, a lot of us think that this whole master race thing started with Adolf Hitler. It actually didn't. It started 30, 40 years earlier, and everybody in the intelligentsia, America, Germany, England, they had all bought into it. I mean, where we were in Portland, there's pictures of families in the 1930s getting blue ribbons because they are superior families and they're getting superior genes. Just crazy stuff like that. Well, really, when I took a look at it, I realized essentially this is glorified bullying. I mean, this is one group of people saying we are superior, and because we have certain rights and liberties over you who are less than, who we see as less than us. And so that formed a central theme in the story, not only eugenics, but at one point, Gilbert gets beaten up by a group of thugs. And, folks who have actually been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment say, yeah, that figures. That was me. And Herbert Wells in the story, he is totally on board with the eugenics mantra and all of its aspects until he realizes that the Martians have landed and now they're the superior group on the planet. And do you really think that the law of the jungle looks so good when you're not one of the lions? So, yeah.
The thing that comes to, go ahead.
No, that was just one example, of stuff. And one other bit, I guess, in real life, especially when I was in the Pacific Northwest. There are exceptions to every rule, but for the most part, I found that the folks who actually, we didn't call it woke in the 90s, but I saw the precursors to folks who would today be, kind of the woke joker, whatever they're calling them this week, uh, culture, where there would be, in the name of tolerance and compassion, they would show absolutely zero tolerance for any viewpoint that wasn't in exact lockstep for their own. And they would be vicious and cruel and sometimes violent to people who they thought weren't as compassionate as they were. So again, I put that in there as well. Gilbert has to deal with folks who are like that, and I'm hoping, that if the sales of the book were during the 2000s were any indication, there were folks who basically, yeah, that message resonated with them too. So happy about
The interesting thing that stuck out to me, I don't know if you ever watched the Mighty Ducks that came out in the 90s. I was in an age where I was watching as a kid,
that. Sure.
and they called the kid, one of the kids called the other kid cake eater as an insult, and I didn't know where that came from.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about that as an insult where you're at.
Yep.
So I thought that was a one-off for the movie. I didn't realize it was a thing.
Oh no, it's still there to my knowledge. Yeah, I've got a lot of friends who still live in Toronto. That is still a thing in the Italian Canadian community. It's interesting.
So transitioning away from the writing side, or let's talk about things from a fan angle. So have you gotten any cool fan art or had anybody cosplay your stuff yet?
Oh well, the first edition. Let me see. I think I showed this to you earlier. The first edition of the sequel. I know we're not really focusing on it, but this was the first edition to the sequel to the Tripods Attack. That was a piece of fan art that ended up being the cover of the first edition, which was really cool. There's a different cover on now. We could look at that a different day. But actually, I did have one young lady who went so far.
While you're talking, if you give me a second, I just had to look up how to do solo layout. I forgot. If you show it now, they'll be able to. If you hold the cover up, they'll be able to see it.
You bet. So this was the original cover of the sequel, The Emperor of North America. And like I said, I don't encourage people to buy this version because a lot of editing pieces slipped through with the publisher I had at the time. Okay. Very nice people, but editing was a challenge. But this was a piece of fan art that ended up becoming the cover to the book, the cover of the sequel. Where was I again? So yeah, fan art.
No.
I have one other young lady who basically at a party, she realized, wait a second, oh, you're that John McNichol? My daughter wants to talk to you. Oh, okay, sure. And daughter was about 13 years old. And she said, could I show, I carry these around because I'm making these now. She had made a number of laminated bookmarks with fan art from the characters from the Emperor of North America and from the Tripods Attack. So I was just like, this is cool. This is very, very cool. They're making bookmarks. I'm making progress. This is awesome. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So has anyone asked for your autograph?
Yeah, that's been good when that's happened too. I've had people ask me for that when they realize, I'm taking doctoral courses now over at the University of Dallas out here. And the fellow sitting at my left one night, he's in his 20s, he said, John McNichol, are you? I'm like, here it comes. Are you related to? And he named my daughter, who's also a student there. Yeah, she's my kid. But then he all of a sudden said, are you the John McNichol who wrote? Yes, I did. And I ended up signing a book for him. So that was nice. But my absolute favorite was, again, when we still lived in the Portland area, I love going to Barnes and Noble for about 3 hours at a stretch. I can just, whatever kind of week I've had, that'll totally relax me. And I actually bumped into a young man who had pulled my book off the shelves and was flipping through it. And I said, could I see that for a second? Sure. I took out my pen and signed it and said, here you go. And he was just like, here's my wallet. Here's my ID. Yeah, this is my book. So you just made my day, buddy. And that was really nice. So it wasn't really solicited, but he was happy for it. But the only time I kind of got sad from a book signing, a wonderful young lady named Jennifer Fitz. She's a blogger and she's a published author now in her own right. She once, I guess, she's one of those homeschooling moms who liked my book. I guess, her son, finally she found something her son wanted to read. And she asked me, to take a copy of one of my books. Would I sign it to, about 4 kids at once? and she gave it to them as a confirmation gift. Well, a couple of years later, I had some local folks who said, we'd like to do some of your books for a book club. Can you get us about 5 copies really quickly? And the fastest I could get were a bunch of used copies on Amazon. They came in, and the first one I looked at, I flipped open, and it was the copy. It was a copy I'd signed to 4 people. They had given it to a used bookstore, I guess, or something, and it had gone halfway across the country to this thing where it had come back to me. I'm just like, all right, I tell myself they probably just enjoyed it enough that they gave it away at the end. Maybe they wanted to share the love, but whatever it was, that was kind of surprising to see my own signature staring back up at me like that.
That is cool. Yeah, that's one of those things where paperbacks, you only read it a couple times, and if you want to pass it on because you only have so much space.
There you go.
So it makes sense that if her kids outgrew it, that they would want to spread the love. That's what it is.
Could be. Yeah. Okay.
And if she's a published author in her own right, we'll have to get her name if she's in speculative fiction community after the show, and we'll see about inviting her on, because we're always looking to diversify with people we've never heard of.
Sounds good.
All right. So do you remember the very first time someone asked you for an autograph?
Very first time was one of my students, actually. Dominic was his name, as I recall. A very quiet young man. But I guess he enjoyed my class enough that just a little bit after the book was published, yes, I announced it, everybody cheered. But he was the first one to come up, and he just handed it to me. And I opened it up and I signed it for him. He asked for my signature. But, it's an incredibly gratifying moment when somebody likes your stuff enough that they want you to put your own personal stamp again on it, not just with the words, but with your signature. So that was fun. That was really, really cool for me.
I wonder how that works in the era where, like, future authors who aren't being taught how to sign their name in cursive.
Oh, I never thought of that.
Or write name. Yeah, they don't teach cursive anymore. So do they just print it?
They might.
No, that'd be interesting.
I never thought of that. I will say this. I've actually got a picture of this still somewhere. But about a decade ago, I had 2 young men who, they know how to do cursive. They had to in my school. But I guess they both of their sisters were in a local production of the Nutcracker Ballet, and their mom made them sit through it. Now, technically, I know that's not child abuse for a boy, but still.
It's skirting the line, sir. It's skirting the line.
It's skirting the line. But I guess they were both so bored. What they did was they actually did their homework. Somehow they got the translation. One wrote their homework in ancient Elvish runes, and another wrote their homework in ancient Dwarven runes. And I took one look at those things, and I was just like, oh, dude, A. Okay, just for the effort. I don't know if it's for real or not, but A, right there. I still have the picture of the both of them. So, yeah, it was pretty cool.
I know he made the Elvish language.
Yes.
Tolkien did. Did he make one for the dwarves, or was that fans done afterwards?
It could be. My guess is they just went on the internet and found some translator or something like that. Here's the dwarf runes or something, and they just answered their questions. Their study questions for the book we were reading at the time. But hey, if they don't know cursive, maybe they'll learn Elvish. Maybe they'll learn Dwarven. We'll see how that goes.
Maybe. I know I was so excited the first time someone asked me for an autograph of one of my books.
Yeah.
I spelled my name wrong because I hardly ever use cursive. I was always faster printing. So like I did doing the cursive, the A and the N sort of run together. So it looked like Hadley instead of Handley. And I had to buy it because he had sent me the copy. I had to go buy another one of my own books so I could give him one signed properly. I still have the one I misspelled around here somewhere. And of course, everyone that knows I was she's like, oh, of course the Grunt's going to spell his name wrong. But
I have to say this too. You said Grunt. When I was in the Air Cadets, we made fun of the Army cadets and we called them grunts, but they called us pigeons. So it all worked out just fine. So
have you ever spotted someone out in public reading one of your books, aside from maybe at that Barnes & Noble?
That Barnes & Noble is the only time I can think of where I actually saw somebody reading my books. Yes, because I have gotten feedback from folks. I've got a couple of fans who still like to talk to me now and again and email me, which is really, really cool. My personal, I won't say it's necessarily a favorite, but it's kind of infamous. I did get one letter, which I still have the scan for, and every now and again I take a look at it for a chuckle. But this one person started off by saying, your books are very well written, and I'm glad you're bringing G.K. Chesterton to a new generation. Okay, I'm waiting for the but. I'm waiting for but there it is. But it's too violent. There's this scene. You've got blood-sucking aliens and giant robots and things blowing up and people throwing up. I've got an extended vomiting sequence in my book at one point. So but the killer for this person, and this I'm sure this homeschooling mom, that homeschooling is great. I mean, my wife did it for 4 years. When it's not, it's like the little girl with the little curl in her forehead. When it's good, it's very, very good. But when it's bad, this poor mom, she said the big problem I had was Gilbert is 16 years old in your novel, and he spends a significant amount of time infatuated with a girl.
It's like she's never met little boys.
Yeah, ma'am, I don't know what your 16-year-old is like. Would you rather I had him fall in love with a puppy or something? I don't know. I remember myself at 16. That was me. Anyone will tell you that. But so yeah, I have
14 or
14.
younger.
Yeah, it's like, oh, girls. Okay, yeah, they're awful when you're 10. And, oh my, I'm 13 now. Yeah. But in any case, so you get all kinds. I'm sure you're aware of this as a published author. It kind of surprises you, some of the people who like your books, even if they don't necessarily share your values, they can appreciate your storytelling. So that's always a nice thing.
And the funny thing is, we used to do it when we were Sci-Fi Shenanigans. We used to do a segment where we'd analyze the reviews, and we stopped doing it because it just didn't feel right, and it just wasn't received as well. One of the trends I noticed as part of that process, though, spending 2 years studying reviews extensively, you'll have the same issue.
Yep.
Too much violence.
Yep.
It's both a 5-star and a 1-star. Like I had somebody write a 1-star for one of my books that said it was like a 12-year-old with ADHD wrote gun porn. I'm like, can I use that in my ad copy?
Oh yeah,
because
for some people, what is an insult to them actually is a selling point to another segment of your audience. Really, that would be great.
I've learned the best way to analyze reviews if you're looking as a consumer, because obviously I still read. I go to the 1-stars and see what they complain about, and generally that'll sell me the book. Don't go out and 1-star my books, people, or his. Like, we're perfectly happy with the 5 stars. I'm just saying, sometimes what people don't like might be the thing we like.
Well, for me, the best part, because I remember, you probably can identify this too. When my book first hit Amazon, when I got my first 1-star review, I mean, I felt like somebody just ripped out my heart and stomped that sucker flat. It was, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. Now I laugh at them, like you say, but the best, I got a 1-star review a while ago, and someone else jumped in and said, "You're an idiot." And basically these two folks are duking it out over my book. And I'm just kind of like, I get the popcorn. I'm having fun watching this. Yeah. Maybe this is what
they actually had a few authors get themselves in trouble replying to comments at a certain point in time. Just because they were being rude to their customers, right?
Oh yeah.
At a certain, there's no win. It's just like, oh, I'm sorry you didn't enjoy the book. I hope you find something more to your liking, and you move on. But at a certain point in time, Amazon removed the ability to comment on the comments.
Oh,
they must have seen where that was going. So now you can vote it helpful, and that is it. You used to be able to also downvote it. You can't do that anymore either. You can just mark them as helpful.
Oh,
so
it's fun for me. Like I said, I'm happy if somebody else likes the books. The only thing that I wish we could do is, if I've switched publishers over time, and I wish I could take all the wonderful reviews I got from the first edition of Tripods and move it over to the second edition. I don't know, haven't been able to find anybody to help me do that yet, but I'll figure it out eventually.
If it keeps the same ISBN and you're uploading it as a new version, you should be able to. I just don't know how. You got to go into KDP, and that's really boring talk. So we can talk off air about that.
Another day. That's fine.
So finally, what is the weirdest or funniest interaction you've had with a fan since you started writing that's obviously family friendly?
Okay. Family friendly. I think it would probably be, once again, that mom who was upset that my main character had a crush on the novel. But actually, one thing that I didn't mention earlier that I thought you might appreciate, when I was writing this book, I actually, if I had a few minutes at the end of class when I was teaching, I'd read a chapter to my class. I'd say, a friend of mine is writing a book. Would you guys like to, basically critique it? They said yes. And the kids liked it, but I had one young man named Robbie who basically slagged it every time. Okay, welcome to America. You can have your opinion. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. But he went so far as to say, I will laugh if this ever gets published. Okay. And it got published. So I made a point of giving him his own copy, but I wrote at the bottom, "Hello, Robbie. Start laughing, Mr. McNichol." And he laughed, and we it was a bit of a good joke. It wasn't like there wasn't any animosity or anything like that. But that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun at that moment. I really enjoyed that day.
I mean, not every book's for everybody. That's like, one of the things we say at the end is that's the right reviews help the right reader find the right book.
Yes.
But right now we're going to pause for a moment. Since in the introduction you told us about your body of work, we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly shill for the man, and I'm going to play that commercial interlude.
Hey.
Across 1,000 battlefields and 1,000,000 wars, there is always a question. What do you do when all the chips are on the table? Do you run? Try to find salvation in the arms of an easy peace? Or do you stand and fight and send your enemies into whatever hole they crawled out of? On Deadly Ground, a heroic Last Stand anthology, has 10 stories addressing that question. Each character faces the impossible in different ways, but all will be tested before the day is done. Can they earn a heroic victory amongst the endless eternity of space, or are they doomed to fall into obscurity?
All right. Thank you for sticking with that commercial interlude.
Absolutely.
We appreciate you. If you haven't read that anthology, it's full of amazing stories. I know because I wrote and helped edit all of them. Or no, I didn't write all of them. I published the book and helped pick all the stories. So and while all of your books that you talked about sounded fascinating, all of your projects with creative endeavors, we want to talk about the Tripod Attacks, which is book 1 in the Young Chesterton Chronicles.
Yes, sir.
So what was the premise for this universe? Obviously, you knew who Chesterton was, but what made you decide to take that and turn it into the story as we know it today?
Well, again, speculative fiction. The best speculative fiction for me asks that question, what if? What if this had gone just a little bit differently? In my world, I've learned to be fascinated, especially not as much as before, but at one point I was totally fascinated with the genre of steampunk. How it's this elegant notion of all the conveniences we have with electronics instead come through steam. And what would have happened? The first computer actually wasn't IBM. The first computer was by a fellow named Mr. Babbage over a century before. And what would have happened if he had actually completed his computer, his difference engine, he called it. And so other authors, had similar speculations. Instead of hackers tapping away at a keyboard, you have clackers who will try to program with punch cards. Instead of the internet, where information shoots along wires with electronics, you have a vast system of pneumatic pipes where messages are fired off. And various individuals are able to pull strings and get that information before it gets to where it's supposed to go. And so I basically created a steampunk universe where the computer revolution came a century early, but it's based on steam rather than on electronics. And what would have happened if you had a G.K. Chesterton type fellow who is 16 years old, who is in the middle of this world, and suddenly everything starts to go very, very crazy. And that's the system I've got in place. That's the premise of the story, and that's the world I built. And I had a great time with it. I really did. It was a lot of fun. And I'm glad to say that I've had enough people saying it is too, that there's a sequel. And finally, it's taken about 10 years. We've had one of those decades where, had one family thing after another, one challenge after another.
It'll do it to you.
Yeah. Well, not only kids. I mean, I just about kicked myself. I was doing what I thought were the final edits, had my laptop with me. I was literally on the last page when a little notice popped up. Hey, if you push this button, I can wipe clean and save about 10 gigabytes of memory on your laptop. Do you want me to do that? Oh, okay. And there,
ooh,
yeah. Now, of course,
I'd be.
Yeah, that went, the edited copy went, the backup of the edited copy went, and I literally had to start from the beginning. And there were other issues that cropped up too. I mean, that was just one of the things. But so
this
far,
is why you store off-site. I learned that the hard way in college, luckily.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm still a bit of a bitesophobe. I mean, up until earlier this year, I still had a flip phone. I mean, I liked my flip phone, but it finally
I
died.
did too, but when I got a new phone, they forced us to do the upgrade to the smartphones because they
Yep,
charge you more to get the lower tech version.
yep, that's it. So in any case, I basically, like you say, I'm off site now. I'm in the cloud, but I'm down to about the last 150 pages of the final edits. And hopefully Gilbert, he goes to in the tripods attack. He fights the bad guys in England, yeah, on the Emperor of North America. He goes and basically fights steampunk cowboys in America. And then in the third book, he's on Mars itself. And so that's where I've got him, and that's where I'm going to get him out of, hopefully. But that's where I'm at right now.
So steampunk as a genre is kind of known for the aesthetics more than anything else. So how loose or tight did you play to the sort of the gearhead steampunk aesthetic that you see people dress up for at cons?
Well, the thing is, you can do something visually with a costume that would be way more difficult to do writing about it. If I'm going to have a guy with a mechanical arm, I'm going to have to explain, however briefly, how that mechanical arm is actually working and accepting impulses from his brain and so forth. And so, essentially, you just kind of look at what was available then and see just how far you can believably tweak it. So, at one point, for example, rather than having the Air Force go after these guys, well, to try and save the world, I have a bunch of men in Da Vinci flying machines. If you've ever seen those, they're kind of like the harnesses that
Yeah.
have things on their backs, and they've got the handles and such. You bring pieces like those in, or where we might normally have, say, an aircraft carrier with all of the base and the agents of Shield and all those other folks are doing their thing. Instead, you have a floating sky harbor with a couple of zeppelins and a very large platform. So that's basically how I like to do the steampunk aesthetic. If you're going to have something technological, you've got to be able to explain very briefly, like within a sentence or two, how something works, why it works. And the other trick is it should be there for a reason. There's an old adage, if you've got a gun on the stage, on the table of a play in Act One, it's got to go off by Act Three. So if you've got all of these cute little buzzwhizzes and gadgets and things like that, if they don't actually pertain to the story or move the story forward in some way, you're wasting your time, you're wasting the reader's time. They eventually are going to get bored. So I have to stick to gadgets and things that'll actually be relevant to the story itself. So that's a bit of a challenge when you're just like, oh, I'm going to put in a steampunk cat. No, it's can't really do anything with it. Doesn't actually make anything happen. But maybe in the sequel, you just kind of push those aside.
So Chekhov's gun got you, huh?
That's it. Check off. That's it. Yes, thank you. I missed that part.
So before we dig in too much into the story itself, we're going to take a moment where I'm going to show you the cover, and you can tell me the story behind this art.
Sure.
I'm going to zoom in so the audience can see sort of the art. But how did you come up with this art?
Well, this isn't my work. This was commissioned by a very, very good artist named Lawrence Klemecki. Uh, he is a Catholic deacon. I laugh when I hear people suggest that religion somehow stifles your creativity, because a lot of the most creative people I know have very, very active faith lives. And so in this particular piece, there is an extended sequence on a train where Gilbert has to try and stop it from crashing. You can see the tripod in the background. And yes, the meteors, that are the great alien cylinders, that's in the background in the form of a comet. But the four characters up front, I actually ended up finding pictures of Chesterton and H.G. Wells when they were 16 years old and got those to the artist. Uh, Father, the real life Chesterton, he did look like that when at one point. Somebody actually said, John, he looks like you when you were 16 years old. Okay, that's nice. My hair was a little bit longer and wavier then, but okay, I'll accept it. Yeah, whatever. But the fellow with the wide brimmed hat is based upon Chesterton's real life, well, not real life, but a character that the real Chesterton wrote extensively about, a mystery solving priest named Father Brown. So it looks like he's floating. If you look, that's actually his foot. He's running from these tripods as well. And in the background, you have a shadowy figure called the Doctor, no relation to the Time Lord. I want to make that very, very clear. He's somebody else, but I leave it to the other folks. Another thing that's really fun about steampunk is you can put lots of characters and references, both real and imagined. And at least a couple of moms have told me it's been fun for their children because they'll immediately now run to the internet and see if there's, who is this guy that Mr. McNichol mentioned. So I'm able to put that in as well. And the real life G.K. Chesterton had a lot of really neat quotes. If you want to talk about the story itself, for example, one of his most famous ones was, any dead thing can go with the flow. Any dead thing can go with the current. It takes something alive to fight it upstream. And at one point, I've got Gilbert. He's in the sewers trying to escape the bad aliens, kind of a thing. And he's debating, should I just let it all go? Should I just give up? And he sees a dead fish floating by and realizes a dead thing goes with the flow. I'm going to fight. I'm going to fight this current. Don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'm going to fight it. And so that's kind of the aesthetic on that. Also, since you've got the Martians and the green, basically the front cover has got a kind of a green motif to it. In the second book, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about another time, he's in a kind of a desert environment for a lot, so it's got a more of a bright orange type of overlapping color. And of course, the third book's probably going to be red because, hey, Mars. But that's basically where all that stuff came from. And at one point, what Catholics call a holy card. It's a picture of a saint. A saint, for those who don't know, in Catholic Christianity, it's kind of like the Hall of Fame of people who were really, really holy, did good things. And Saint Michael the Archangel is one of them. And an actual little holy card becomes very, very important as a plot point. I don't want to give too much away because, hey, I want people to buy the book. So there's that.
Absolutely. So moving on to the book itself, what would your 30-second elevator pitch be for the Young Chesterton Chronicles?
Okay.
And specifically the tripod attacks.
You bet. Well, it depends on who I'm talking to, but for most folks, I'd say this is a steampunk novel. It's aimed at the middle to high school level. The kids like it, but moms and dads like it too. And basically, it takes a historical figure, puts him in an alternate timeline universe where he has a bunch of incredible adventures. And as I've said before, it's not necessary. Some folks will call it Christian fiction. I will say it is fiction. Yeah, there are Christians in it, but it's also got giant robots, things blowing up, people throwing up, blood-sucking aliens, the whole bit. So I put all the things into the book that I would have wanted to see in a book I read at that age. That works for me.
Okay. So what do you think makes the tripod attacks in the series writ large special?
Well, there are a lot of steampunk novels out there. Okay, but so far as I know, I've actually been praised. You mentioned Declan Finn. He actually praised it because I bring up authors who really have been, in my opinion, unfairly shunted to the side, like G.K. Chesterton. And I'm able to give them a voice. And so H.G. Wells, yes, people know who he is, but there are a lot of aspects to his personality that people don't know that I put into the Tripod's Attack. By today's standards, he'd be a galloping racist, for example. And, I show not only that he did have those opinions, but how he is able to surmount those. So it takes the hero's journey. It takes a hero who was a person in real life, and yet it still puts them in a fantastic element that a lot of folks like to. And for me, that's the fun of writing a big story. You get to write something people want to read about somebody who was a real person, and you get to bring their story to thousands. It's a good feeling.
So you were ahead of your time. You beat Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Exactly. Yes. And I don't mind that nobody compares the two because apparently it was a terrible movie. Nobody saw it, so I won't really know. But yeah, that's the idea. Take the real person, put him in a crazy situation. Just like that.
Okay, and this is the one thing, I'm going to try not to go on a soapbox because I'm a history major. You never win when you compare people from the past to modern sensibilities, you have to compare them against the standard of their time, or you're doing everyone a disservice. Because I'm sure in 100 years we'll have stuff we believe that people are going to be like, oh, those insert insult here, or like, what were they, barbarians? I mean, that's just the nature of the evolution, like of humans and time. And so I try to judge them against the backdrop of the period they lived in, and it comes up a lot when you talk with our founding fathers and slavery issue. And it's just like, yeah, slavery was horrible, obviously, but if they wanted to do more than the law allowed, then that's the steps that led to where we are now. Like, things just have to happen. They don't happen all at once. You've got to build up to it. So you kind of judge them against the period they're from. And in that case, I don't think he was as bad as some people would say he was. Wells, I mean, I studied him some in college as well. So,
Sure.
I mean, yes, we would sort of like the crazy uncle, right? We'd cringe now, but compared to his peers, oh yeah, he wasn't so bad.
Right. No, and I would agree with that. But that's where Chesterton actually distinguished himself. He was pretty much the only member of the intelligentsia who would be where we are today and saying, no, eugenics, bad. Saying that people, certain races better than others, bad. And so he was the man who was truly ahead of his time. And that's one other reason why this particular series is different. I'm taking a fellow who really, if you looked at what he said, you wouldn't be upset. He actually flat out said he actually wrote a book about eugenics and other evils. And eugenics meant, race basically was racism writ large. So,
yeah.
And I'm sure if you really picked everything apart that he said, I'm sure you'd find something that's problematic by today's standards. But that'd probably be for you and me.
That's because language evolved. So what was an acceptable term for a group of people back then and wasn't considered insulting or derogatory is now, as either we've become more aware of things, or in some cases meanings have just shifted. It happens over time. And so like I get the tendencies of people to want to wish everyone is as good as they could be by whatever we believe that to be now. But as a trained historian, I'm like, that's a losing proposition. But again, I will not get on a soap. So you're going to be as bad as Declan. You're going to get me talking history, and we're going to have a 4-hour podcast, and Cisca's going to get mad at me. It's going to be a thing. So instead, I will ask you, which tropes do you feel like the tripod attacks hits the best?
Oh, well, for me, if I had to pick one trope I've always liked, and it'll always be my favorite one to write about. It's the person who basically has had a relatively normal life up to this point, and then something has completely shifted. And now our hero, who may have been a farm boy or something else, suddenly finds themselves in a completely new life situation, and they have to adapt all the tools and all the skills they've built up until now, adapted to the new situation they're in. And they prevail because they don't give up, and they don't stop learning, and they don't stop adapting. So that's the kind of person I really like to write about. That's the kind of hero I like to write about the most. And that's the trope you're going to get in the Tripods Attack. There you go.
Okay. And this is just off the wall, this wasn't even a prep one. If Chesterton was able to somehow come back to life and he knew you wrote a book, this series about him, how do you think because you studied him pretty extensively,
Sure.
How do you think he'd react to this book series?
Boy, I think he'd like it, because the real life Chesterton, when he got to be an adult, he was about 350 pounds or so. He was a big man. In fact, somebody asked him during World War I, why aren't you out at the front? He turned sideways and he said, "Madam, you can see, I am." He's out at the front. But I think he would love to see himself put as a hero in a series of books. I will have to say that when this particular series first came out, a number of the older members of the American Chesterton Society apparently did not appreciate it. I had one person go so far as to say, well, person X, who is a bigwig, and I don't know their name, but person X said, I want this guy's head on a pole outside my office. So yay, I got somebody mad enough to say that. That was kind of cool. But I think to their credit, they did let both Tripods Attack and the Emperor of North America get reviewed in their magazine, Gilbert Magazine. So I don't know how true that was. I will say that I think Chesterton himself, he loved adventure, And if you read his stuff, sometimes it just carries you away. Like it's reading it is like watching a swashbuckler do his thing on the mast of a ship. So him as an adventurer, blowing up giant robots and saving the pretty girl, I think he would have loved it. I think he'd. And hey, if he's up in heaven right now, I like to think that he did look down and he got to see a copy over somebody's shoulder, and he did like it. So there you
go. Yeah. And one of the things I don't understand, people asking him about the World War I stuff.
Yes.
If he was born in 1974,
yes,
and World War I started for us in 2016,
I know
that he'd have been too old to be drafted. He'd have been like 42. I don't think they were drafting that old.
Actually, remember for the British, it started in 1914, and they were having people, I think.
So he'd been 40. Okay.
Yeah, he would have been 40. I think 41, if I'm not mistaken. I was just reading this, a poem by Robert Service to my students this past week about signing up. And one fellow says, I'm under 41, so I'm going to war, kind of thing. So technically he could have maybe made it, but I don't think he would have lasted too long.
So he was a contemporary then of Tolkien, right?
Yes, apparently so. Although I don't know that they actually interacted with each other. Tolkien actually did fight in World War I, as did C.S. Lewis, but I don't know that they actually interacted with one another. I'd have to.
Tolkien was at the Somme.
Well,
that was horrific.
Tolkien was at the Somme. Actually, hang on. What did happen, and I do have this. I do reference this with a couple of characters in the Emperor of North America. I don't want to give too much away, but C.S. Lewis later on, when he was wounded, if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to look this up to get all the details right, but he found himself reading G.K. Chesterton. And Lewis, at the time, was an atheist. Lewis was the guy who ended up writing all the Narnia books.
Yeah.
And Lewis basically said, I found Chesterton to be an incredibly, eminently reasonable writer, apart from his Christianity, of course. I will say this, when my Emperor of North America, one of the most fun things I did was I actually put Lewis and Tolkien as a couple of prepubescent boys on the same airship as Tolkien, and Lewis as Chesterton rather. And Lewis recognizes Chesterton. You're Mr. Chesterton. Yes, I am. Now please go away. Oh no, I'm your biggest fan. And he just never leaves the poor guy alone. So I had a good time with that one. No one's beaten me up from the Lewis camp yet, so I'm happy on that score.
Does he still have a camp? I don't know.
I would imagine. Enough people still buy his books, but I don't think anybody is like as passionate about it as him or Tolkien, but who knows?
Fair. So we've talked about that this was the tropes, but what subgenre? Obviously, it's Christian science fiction based on your categorization on Amazon, and you said it was steampunk. Were there any other genres that you think it would fit? Maybe men's adventure fiction?
Men's adventure, except that I do know I've got several very, very ardent female fans as well. And my absolute, what apparently seems to work really well, I've had some folks say, let's not call it steampunk. That's kind of passe now. Alternate history, apparently, is what I've had some folks refer to it as. So perhaps that makes even a little more sense to me, because it diverges from our history line when Babbage ends up making his steam engine, kind of a thing, his difference engine. So that's basically where that comes from. I would, probably alternate history might be good, even though there aren't any actual tripods or men on Mars, but who knows? We'll see what happens.
So when they get to Mars, are they going to meet any princesses?
I wouldn't be adverse to that. I doubt it. One can always hope. It's funny you should ask that, because I actually got asked to talk about my books at Oricon, which is like the big science fiction convention in Oregon. And I actually had 3 people dressed up as Star Wars figures say, "Do you believe in aliens?" And I said, well, I keep an open mind about it. I mean, maybe. I think it's unlikely they've evolved exactly like us. I think it's a possibility. And these folks, bear in mind, they're dressed like Star Wars figures. They said, well, the Bible doesn't mention aliens. Okay, well, you know what? The Bible doesn't mention New York City either, but it's still there. So, I said a lot gentler, I like to think, than that. These folks walked out of the room. So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how you'd end up categorizing that, but as far as other tropes, again, I forget the exact question, but I'll go with alternate history. I'll go with all the other stuff. I'm good with it.
Okay. So now let's talk about the story itself. What can you tell us about your main character? You've talked a little bit about Chesterton, the historic figure, and how that inspired the series, The Young Chesterton. But what can you tell us about the young Chesterton as he's portrayed in this series?
Well, okay, I could tell you a little bit about the plot. Young Gilbert, he doesn't really. He's been raised. Now, the real Gilbert Chesterton. This is a part that many of the real fans of the real G.K. Chesterton had issues with. The real G.K. Chesterton was very, very English, very, very British, often referenced British history. But my Gilbert, because the difference engine was created, it threw a lot of things we take for granted today out of whack. So Gilbert instead is raised in on the plains of Minnesota. Okay, and he's basically a little house in the prairie kid. Doesn't quite fit in. He's smarter than the other kids around him. His parents are different. Dad likes to tool with a rifle that has about 15 different magnification scopes. Mom is really, really good with knives. She can, take one of Dad's kills and gut it and dress it in about half the time that anyone else can. So Mom and Dad are different. Gilbert's different. They have a very nice house and no visible means of income. He doesn't question it. His parents die in a mysterious accident, and somehow he ends up getting ported over to England. He's supposed to take actually a ship from England to his next destination, but unfortunately, due to another set of circumstances, he doesn't manage to get on the HMS Titanic. Poor kid. So he ends up being an orphan on the streets of Dickensian London. He takes a job not in a blacking factory or anything like that, but he has a talent for mathematics, numbers, and language. And so he ends up getting a job in a clacking factory. And he learns how to do all the little punch card pieces. That in itself ends up being very useful to him several times in the story. When he's getting beaten up, his friend, or his new friend, H.G. Wells, comes to his rescue, shows him a bit about how the world works. One of the more fun elements I had putting into this. How much time do we have, by the way? I didn't want to.
Oh, we're good. I mean, we're running late, but we're just gonna have a long episode. So
sounds good. One of the most fun characters I had, because he meets this girl. You talked about being 16 years old and 14. You all know what it's like when suddenly a pretty girl walks by, your heart jumps into your throat, and oh my gosh, I absolutely have to marry this person. For Gilbert, it's a redheaded girl, and she kind of drops in and out of his life. He sees her once in his boss's office when he's suddenly promoted to being a journalist from being a clacker. He sees her on this train that's about to basically jump the rails, and only he can save them. And the reason I put her in there as a character, this is one of the more interesting aspects about the real life G.K. Chesterton's work. Somebody noticed, if you read his books and his short stories, a red-headed girl jumps in and out. Sometimes she's just there for about 3 lines. Sometimes she bookends at the beginning, at the end, and sometimes she's there for the whole book. But Chesterton kept on putting a very clearly described red-headed girl as a character in almost all of his fiction for varying amounts of time and space. And what was interesting was we never knew, Chestertonians, people who are really into G.K. Chesterton, they were debating like crazy who was the red-headed girl. Well, we found out back about the mid-90s, Chesterton had a very young secretary who helped him and his wife. She was 16 or so when he died. That secretary's nephew, all the way up in about the mid-90s, found her trunk and found Chesterton's first book, never published, called Basil Howe. And it detailed a young 19 or 20-year-old man, Chesterton's age at the time, who has an unrequited crush on the redheaded cousin of one of the members of his debating team. And so they figured out she was probably the redheaded girl. But in my story, I get to put her in as a character who just kind of jumps in and out of his life and helps him out, makes trouble, helps him out again. And he finds out more about who she is by the end of the story. But I leave all the most tantalizing details out until later books. But that's a bit about Gilbert, and that's a bit about the other characters. So Hope that helps. Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what about secondary characters? Obviously, there's the redheaded girl.
Yep.
What about the other other secondary characters? Which ones are your favorites and are most memorable?
Well, I liked writing Herb Wells because, again, as I said, by our standards today, he would have been a galloping racist. Over time, you see, most of us have that friend or that one or two friends where you were completely different, but you were still best buddies. And Chesterton mentions that again. You know, the Crusader and the Saracen had something in common. You know, this one said God is one, this one said God is three, but they can still begin a very manly, quarrelsome friendship, you know, I think is how he put it. And that's the kind of friendship that Gilbert has with Herb Wells. Herb, again, most of us have that friend who, you know, they may have been our best buddy, but they kind of went in a wrong direction at one point. Herb does that, and Gilbert can't save him, and he realizes that. It's, you know, not what you may think, you know, when we usually say he made poor decisions. It's other stuff instead. And Herb basically ends up having to try and find redemption in his own way. But so I enjoyed writing the character of Herb in that sense because I could draw on people who were my own good friends, and in some cases are still very good friends today from my own high school years. I enjoyed writing the character of Father Brown because Chesterton writes him so clearly and so concisely. You've got a real clear sense of what this man's personality was like, and he's blunt, but he's never cruel. So I enjoyed that. The character of the Doctor, a little bit more slippery. The Doctor is a character, and he works for a group that calls itself the Special Branch. Many folks, oh, he works for MI5. No, 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 not that Special Branch. A very different group of people. But, you know, all the secondary characters, I had to eliminate some of them, you know, in various drafts. And believe it or not, one of my favorite secondary characters, my editor said, no, you've got to kill this person off. Why? Because it's good for the story. I did, and he was right. You know, my editor Todd was a wonderful man and a living saint for putting up with me and all of my typographical errors, no less. But yeah, all of those are the three or four main secondary characters. And what was fun too, Gilbert, in the real life, Gilbert married a woman who was about 3 feet shorter than him in real life. Her name was Frances. I got to put her in as a character near the end of the Tripod's attack. I have Gilbert meet Frances for the first time. But again, that's when I got probably my first kind of twitty, anal retentive fan. Somebody shot me a thing. I liked your book, but you got Frances's eye color wrong on page 430. Really? Really? You're going to bust me for that? Okay, all right, whatever. But yeah, those are the main secondary characters: the redhead and Herb, Father Brown, and the Doctor. So those are the main secondary folks that Gilbert gets to work with.
So, what can you tell us about the bad guys that Chesterton has to face in this, without spoilers, obviously?
Okay, well, bad guys. You have your standard group, you know, in many ways that are bent on world domination. But heck, that's kind of an old trope. So what I ended up doing was researching just what kinds of groups considered themselves Illuminati or world girther type guys, what kinds of men were interested in doing that and basically trying to control and run things during that time period. And so, again, looking at the lives of I picked about 4 or 5 guys. And if, again, history aficionados may be able to pick them out. I don't actually name them until the 3rd book at all. But some of them are fictional and some of them are based on real life characters. But those are the ultimate guys who are pulling the strings of the world. And Gilbert doesn't even realize exactly what's going on. You know, the way the Doctor at one point puts it, most people, they're like worms living under the house of a king. And Gilbert eventually realizes this is the king that's trying to take over the kingdom. And he has to do what he can and as best he can to overthrow that. So let's see how that goes.
Do you touch on the robber barons that would have been around at that time?
Yeah,
potentially.
Absolutely. And like I said, if you read it, you'll probably pick out a couple of them. If you're a fan of that time period, that's what I did. You know, I kind of took I don't want to sound pretentious here, but I looked at other storytellers who had written great stories in their own time, and what did they do? George Lucas immersed himself in all these mythologies, and so before I ever wrote the book or started writing the book, I just kind of immersed myself not only in steampunk pieces and tropes, but also just in the people and the fiction, the fictional characters of that time period. What people, fictional or real, would have been kind of in a round table, let's take over the world conspiracy that a guy like Gilbert would end up foiling without without their knowledge initially.
Okay, so as authors, we often do horrifically nasty things to our characters.
Yep.
So if G.K. Chesterton and H.G. Wells and company met you in a back alley and they knew who you were and you were the creator of their torment, how do you see that playing out?
I think Chesterton would be most upset that I killed off his parents, because in real life, they were there and they supported him throughout most of his lifetime. But I killed them off when he was 16. You know, it's a trope you kind of have to do nowadays. You know, the superhero has to be an orphan. We all know that. And H.G. Wells, I think he'd be kind of happy because he had a long string of lady friends, and I think he'd be kind of liking the fact that he's the one who kind of has to initiate Gilbert into that world. No, this is how you talk to a girl. No, you don't talk to philosophy to a girl. They're not interested in philosophy. And I can just wait to hear, my girlfriend was good. That's not the kind of girl that Herb is interested in, and so forth. So I don't think Herb would be too upset. I will say this, what was really, really weird, and again, I don't want to give too much away, but I have Herb end up finally getting into a kind of a long-term, dysfunctional, toxic relationship with a woman in the second book, the sequel to Tripods. And I thought, well, who's the most evil woman from that time period? And I found a bunch of quotes. Later on, after I'd written the book, I found out the real life H.G. Wells did have an affair with this woman that I put him with. And I was kind of like, what? It's like, he cheated on his second wife with her, and she cheated on her third husband with him. So, I mean, I was just kind of like, all right, okay, whatever.
So given when Chesterton was born, his parents would have been of age during the Civil War, or at least alive,
yes.
Depending on their ages. In your version of history, like, because you said at some point in time you changed history, did the Civil War happen?
Well, yes and no. There were a couple of authors who suggested that the United States actually did not conclude their business with the Civil War, but just ended up fragmenting further. And so initially, the Americas are split into no fewer than 5 smaller countries. So that was also a good little piece I ended up doing, because I have the character of John Carter pop up. And one of the things I always took issue with about John Carter was he never talked in his books like a Virginia gentleman. He talked like a British guy, or like Doc Savage, or, like Conan sped forward a few hundred years, 2,000 years, whatever it would be. And so, yeah, there is a civil war, but people from the South refer to it as the War of Northern Aggression, or in some.
I heard that growing up in Virginia.
Yep. So, some other folks, suggested I try and put a modern spin on it. Okay. So, some folks say, this is your right to choose a slave. You don't have the right to come down and tell me, Washington, what I'm going to do with my property. So some folks, the War of Northern Aggression was one that was often used. Slave wars is the way some folks just euphemistically called it in the North. I always bring that up when someone says, well, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. Yeah, it was. If you look at the South, its first vice president called slavery in his inaugural address a philosophic, scientific, moral good that everybody should be adhering to. So, okay, yeah, it was based on slavery. We could debate that, but go ahead.
They would argue that it was about states' rights, but then you ask the next question: states' rights to do what? Oh, slavery.
Yeah,
so
that's it, yeah.
They're arguing a semantics. It's a distinction without a difference.
Precisely. And again, history teacher and history major. So I think we both have common ground on that. So yes, and that's again a fun piece. What do you do, say, if Harry Turtledove, who I had the good fortune to meet at a con a couple of years back,
Nice.
he wrote a great piece. He saw my book. He's like, cool, thank you. And I don't think he ever read it, but that's okay. I gave him a copy of my book. But he wrote a piece exactly asking that question called "The Guns of the South." What happens if the
Oh,
South,
yeah.
remember that? What happens if the South wins the Civil War because it suddenly gets a hold of about 10,000 AK-47s? And so that's another question I ask. Well, the difference engine not only brings the computer revolution a century early, what else does it help other people do? In this case, it helps the South win the Civil War.
So the South had a superior military, but the North had the logistics, which always goes back to prove, like the angry staff officer talk about, logistics wins wars.
Yep.
The issue you'd run into is some would argue that the Greeks had some form of computer with some of the technology. If you look at like the drawings that existed now, whether they were actually building that or it was just someone dreaming big on a piece of paper, that's up for debate. But they have found some things that they at least attempted to build in some of the dives. Right. So you could even get really weird, like Da Vinci Code level with that if you wanted to.
Sure. And what actually I had fun doing was when somebody was trying to decipher, because American history is kind of challenging to people who are in Europe. I mean, they don't necessarily understand a lot of the nuances. I had basically America fragment further. Well, after the South wins the Civil War, Texas breaks away. Hey, we can make our own country. And then California breaks away and then breaks further into Northern and Southern California, because
there were plans for all of that. So
yeah, everyone who's been to California knows those are pretty much two different places anyway, North and South. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, America is fragmented into 5 countries during this particular piece. So that's another big difference I had, and another fun thing to write about.
Okay. So how much of the technology that you were putting in there did you take from real life?
Well, I did take. Oh, go ahead.
I was just say, for instance, one of the things that that changed the course of agriculture in the South was the cotton gin, right? Like with Eli Whitney. Some would argue that at one point in time, slavery would have faded out anyway because it became economically unfeasible. The cotton gin comes and reinvigorates things. If you're already taking alternative viewpoints, I mean, it wouldn't take much to turn the cotton gin into something steam powered and fitting a steampunk aesthetic. So I guess what I'm asking is, at what point did you make the change from the world as we knew it to the world you're writing? Is there a dividing line that's pretty clear?
I try to make that pretty clear at the very beginning. I mentioned Charles Babbage was an inventor in the early 1800s, and he claimed that he had plans for a machine he called a difference engine. It really wasn't any more powerful in terms of its computing ability than a 4-function calculator would have today. But if it had actually been built, I think it would have filled about 2 or 3 classrooms in terms of all the pistons and steams and gauges that were required. Now, Mr. Babbage never finished his machine. I think he worked on it 13 years and only finished 1/8 of it, if I'm not mistaken. Interestingly enough, in our modern age, somebody with a lot more spare time and cash than probably you or me actually did finish building the thing, and it does work. It did work, so yay for him. But in his case, when he built that particular computer, the first essential computer, that's the dividing line. That's where things start to switch. And so you have the electric light, you have triple-decker trains that are running on these punch card codes that can do so without a driver in some cases to a certain point. You've got your Vinci flyers. You've got your steam-powered networks of pipes that'll get information everywhere. You've got all kinds of things. You could even have, I throw in, if you know H.G. Wells' lore, cavorite is an element that a fellow discovers that's got anti-gravity properties. And that's where you get actually a floating city in the second book. But for me, the clearest dividing line is right when Babbage actually creates his machine. And that's what changes everything. And alters the timeline and gives me all kinds of liberty to write all kinds of fun adventures.
Sounds fun. It's amazing to think about, like the Da Vinci flying machine. They've had people build from those schematics. They
Yep.
actually work with very
Yep.
minimal tweaking.
Mhm.
The Mayan calendar, was accurate within, fractional seconds
Cool.
up until probably about 2000. Like they were predicting astronomical phenomenon,
Hmm.
and they did it all without a calculator. They did it in their noggins, and that's just amazing to think about.
Yep, absolutely. And
And because we don't know how they do it, that's how we get, oh, it had to be aliens.
I'm not. What's that meme? I'm not saying it was aliens, but
I'm not
aliens.
saying it either.
Either. You can toss it about and stuff like that. I have a good time with my students and saying, you've got more brain power at your disposal, all the information literally from the time of humanity's beginning. And we use it to play League of Legends and get pictures of cats. Okay, sounds good. Let's keep going. But oh well.
Yeah, we've learned a lot. So that's one of the things we've learned through history, is at one point in time we studied the dates, and we memorized those. And then, you start thinking about how things change and how much we know and don't know. And we actually have historical archaeology. What's the word? I can't remember the term for it. It's where they actually go and they live like the people would have to try to understand. It's not.
I've seen reality shows about that, but I didn't know there was an actual.
There's an actual name for it. LARPing comes to mind, but that's not it. Where they're actually living. It's not reenacting, but they're actually like living historians, or there's a term for it. I can't remember.
Oh, very cool.
It's been a long time since I got my master's degree in colonial history, but like you don't think about how certain, minor things make a difference. So you study like Shiloh, for instance, and you see, well, the time of the battle, they should have been sunlight, but there wasn't, because without daylight savings time, it wasn't actually this time, it was this time. And suddenly, okay, well, now the morning mist makes sense. And so it's not just what's written, it's understanding the history in the larger context that makes it come to life. I had a history professor teaching Civil War history. I can't remember the guy's name to save my life, but I can picture him in my head. He was a visiting professor. And one of the things he made us do is put on the war uniforms, grab a rifle, and march around and do the maneuvers. And then, you start marching up a hill in formation, and it starts to make a lot more sense, right? Like some of what they're doing, and having the actual fire in volleys. And in our case, we fired at dummies, and you saw how much of us missed. And stuff. It's just the balsters weren't that accurate. The muskets or even the rifles were only good to, what we would consider pistol range probably today. And so when you start understanding all that and how minimal changes could change everything. Like, what if the Black Hand missed? World War I never happens.
Right.
And so that's the fun thing about alternative history is you could pick one small, seemingly insignificant thing, and everything's different. That's where you get the step on a butterfly time travel paradox, right? You go back to the dinosaurs and you step on a butterfly and you have what they call the butterfly effects.
Yes.
And
that
so
Bradbury's story. I remember that. Yes.
Yeah, and so it's one of the fascinating things about alternative history is when you start to just really think about it. And if I change this, what happens? I wish more sci-fi authors did that with their technology. Okay, let's say I do invent this, widget. Okay, how does that change things? And they want to have the cool widgets and then have everyone do everything like we did it today. Well, no, because that's going to change everything. So maybe I'm just biased because I grew up in an age where I watched some of that in real life. I went from when I learned marksmanship, you learned a side profile silhouette to aim because you had no body armor, so you didn't want to make a bigger target. You get body armor with the sappy plate on your chest to cover your vital organs, and suddenly you're standing, feet planted, chest out, because if you're going to get shot, might as well hit the chest plate,
That's it. Yep.
And that changed tactics drastically. And if that one small change makes it, what about all these other changes? What would that do if that was different?
Sure. No, I've got a dear friend who is I taught with for several years. He's an actual Texas historian. If I'm not mistaken, he published an academic paper recently, and his thesis, and it's very, very defensible, was that the colonization of the state of Texas took right off when they invented air conditioning. And if you've had to live through a Texas summer, I've heard people call it hell's front porch down here. It makes perfect sense that you wouldn't have people moving down here unless they could stay cool. So yeah, one little event.
I mean, was it Orlando, I think, built a statue to the guy that invented air conditioning?
I could believe it. I could totally believe it. God bless the man.
Although I've been to Colonial Williamsburg up here, and you look at the way the buildings were designed. Part of that is when you design a building to accommodate the actual local weather, you can do that naturally, and it doesn't get as hot in there as we would think of these, isolated boxes we built today.
Okay.
So that plays a factor too. That's why they had the transom windows over the doors. It was to allow the heat to escape, or the cool air in with breezes. That's how you get the shotgun houses in Louisiana, where the humidity can get stifling. It's because if you open both doors, you get a breeze straight through the house.
Oh, there you go.
And that's the kind of stuff people don't think about when they write alternative history. That's why people like Harry Turtledove did such an amazing job, is because he got into that nitty gritty and he said, okay, what if I changed this one thing?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's cool that you did the same thing with your difference engine. I'd never even heard of that.
Oh, yeah.
That's crazy. How did you stumble upon that to get that idea?
Well, I mean, I remembered the first time I actually heard of it was when I was about 15 years old. It was 1985, 86 school year. And I was in Mr. Grimes's computer class. Back then, we were still tapping away on Apple IIs and Commodore 64s in basic
I had a
language.
64.
Yeah. Oh, good. So yeah, you remember. And the only time you'll see basic computer language used anymore is, like, I think in the second or third season of Stranger Things, when Sam Gamgee gets eaten by a bunch of dogs after he programs something in basic. But you remember that? Yeah. But no, we had to take a test on the history of computers. Mr. Grimes was very, we wanted to learn how am I going to build Space Invaders? I want to make my own video games. No, first you're going to learn the history of computers, and we ground our teeth. But that's where I first saw the Babbage's difference engine, and there have been other books and stories. I think there's an entire book called The Difference Engine, kind of a thing, and it has a number of all those steampunk tropes put into it, everything, and so forth. But that was the first place I ever saw that, and people have suggested what would have happened if that had come in. There have been a number of books in the steampunk genre that have asked that. What if this particular event occurred? My daughter got seriously mad at me for one of them because she loves the story Pride and Prejudice. And I teach English. I've taught the book 3 times. I'm sorry, I do not understand why any girl would like Fitzwilliam Darcy other than the fact that he's rich. He has no personality. That's my opinion. But there was a steampunk story written where they talking about one particular event. What if Admiral Nelson lost to Old Hooky Nelson? General Nelson lost to Napoleon at Waterloo. Well, suddenly he has to go to the Bentley and Darcy family and all these other folks at Pemberley for help. So suddenly the Pride and Prejudice crew are on these, they call them moonboats, these little tiny dirigibles, and they lead an attack on Napoleon's fortress, kind of a thing. It's kitschy fun. But again, what if? What if this battle had gone the wrong way? What if Napoleon could have gotten on a horse and seen the battlefield a little easier? Little known fact, apparently part of the reason he lost at Waterloo was because he had terrible hemorrhoids that morning and couldn't sit on his horse. So he couldn't actually see what was going on in the battle. He had to rely on reports.
And fun fact, he's not as short as the popular media would have you think that the little man syndrome is known as Napoleon complex.
Yep.
He wasn't actually that short.
He towered over several guys. The average guy was about 5'1". He was 5'4", I think. So yeah, he would have towered over most.
Yeah, and he it could have gone either way at Waterloo. They split their forces to defeat. Was it? There's a name for that maneuver where they defeat in detail, I believe is the expression, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, so that could have gone either way. So it's not unfeasible at several points along the way. So we've talked a lot about your characters in the world, and we dabbled far afield into history nerddom, which I was loving all of. Hope we didn't bore the audience. But since we talked about characters, do you have a favorite character archetype when you're writing?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think I mentioned him earlier. I love the kind of character who basically has figured out how to live life in this direction. Luke Skywalker doesn't like being a farm boy in Tatooine, but he knows how to do it, or things like that. Odysseus, he likes being a farmer king. He knows how to do it. He's got it pretty much sewn up. And I love to have a situation where you've got somebody who essentially is comfortable and has all the tools mentally and physically they need to exist in the world they know. And suddenly they're dropped in the middle of a world they don't know, and they have to adjust using what they've got. There was I think Emilio Estevez was in a similar. This was one film that kind of inspired me in that trope. It's a film called Judgment Night, where they are just basically a bunch of guys who are, fun fellows. They're salesmen. They're successful stockbrokers, and suddenly they end up in a family camper in the worst part of town in the ghetto, and they can't get out for various reasons. So they're stuck there. How do they survive? And so that's the kind of trope I really, really like to see. Can this person use what they know now and adapt it to their new circumstance? So that's the kind of trope I like to see as much in a character as much as possible.
So that Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court vibe going on?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, although Mark Twain, he always liked to be the smartest guy in the room, and he often was. I won't begrudge him that. But the Connecticut Yankee, he is the smartest guy. He figures out how to bring electricity, and he uses all of his machine abilities to his advantage in King Arthur's Court. What if you've got somebody who really doesn't their skills don't translate quite as easily as, say, a mechanical engineers would over in Arthurian England? In the case of Gilbert, he has to learn a new skill. He has to learn how to do punch carding, modern day programming. How is he going to be able to use that now that he's got that skill to stop a runaway train and save everybody on board? How is he going to use that to break out of this little collector box that the tripods have put him in, which is where they put their victims before they suck their blood out? How is he going to get out? So how is he going to get out of the sewers that he's stuck in using what he knows now? So and again, when you put him in that situation, figuring it out in a way that's not going to leave the reader feeling cheated or deus ex machina, like I'm just going to lower a chair from the gods and save him that way. That's the most gratifying part for me, when I'm actually able to convincingly put somebody in a difficult situation and figure out, as if I was there, how are we going to get out of this? How do we get out of this? So that's me.
So you mentioned that the tripod attack is part of the series. We've talked about the book 2, and that you're writing book 3. It's the Young Chesterton Chronicles.
Yep.
After the third book, what's next? Is there going to be more in this world?
That all depends on how well it sells, to be quite honest. I basically had just finished the first draft of Tripod's Attack, got published in 2008, and The Emperor of North America got published 2 years later in 2010. And by 2012, I had published another book, a side book for the grade 4 through 8 crowd, called The King's Gambit, and it was really well received for that crowd too. It's also by my publisher, Hillside. But I had just finished the first draft of Where the Red Sands Fly, where Gilbert is on Mars, and he's looking for a pair of siblings he didn't know he had. What happened, among other things, we had some family upheavals. My wife had a debilitating stroke, which, basically,
I'm sorry.
She's doing great now. You wouldn't know it. She's just doing wonderfully. It's been close to 10 years now, but all those kinds of events and all the things, we ended up moving out of state to Texas. We had a lot of pushback from folks who thought it was not a good idea at the time. It turned out to be a good idea. Thank you. All the rest. But we just had so many things going on. And I still could see Gilbert having, I just knocked my laptop back a little bit. Gilbert could have a number of adventures, but we'll just see what happens with it. I've got him, basically, Gilbert, one of the things that it was a lot of fun to do with Where the Red Sands Fly, the third book, I managed to flip Gilbert back and forth between his time as a 40-year-old and as an 18-year-old. Things he does when he's 18 have a direct effect and consequence on when he's 40. And so for me, if I were to do a fourth book, I'd have to decide, am I going to set this, in his 18-year-old time period or in his 40-something time period? So that's one thing that I would have to consider. Maybe I'll do both. I've done a few short stories for the children of friends with characters from Gilbert and so forth. So I might stick to that initially, but I'll wait till the inspiration hits me.
Okay. So we've talked about all of the steampunk technology that you put into this book. You've told us a lot about the world. What tech that you created specifically for this book or this universe would you want for your own use?
Oh gosh.
Would any of it trump what we already have now? Would any of it be an improvement?
Honestly, you remember the 64. You remember the Commodore 64? We had the
I
discs
do.
back then. You had the floppy
Yeah.
disks. You had to pop them in. And we are at a point now, actually, I had a thumb drive around my neck, and one of my students looked at it and said, "What's that?" I'm like, "Are you where do you store your information? In the cloud. Okay. Personally, I love the idea. I know, you could argue that, yeah, I lost an edited version of my book, and had to start from scratch again. But I love the idea of basically just having a punch card, a blank card, and having a little gadget where I could just snip, 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 and things would happen. To me, I would put a disc into a black box, and on the screen would be a game or something that I could use to get an A in school with, or I could type a paper and just move the cursor back and change it. Revolutionary. If I could pick any of that information for myself, I'd love to be able to do the punch cards myself. The idea that I could just clip, 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 and the average person would not be able to discern it, but I know what it is, and it would be safe so long as I could preserve that paper. So that's I think what I would like the most is to have punch card technology. You put in the slot, the pins drop down through the holes, and where the holes are, that's what makes the magic happen. That's how punch card technology worked then. That's how it works in my book. That's what I'd like to have if I could pick one thing from that today.
Okay. So obviously your books have aliens in them.
Yep.
We've kind of covered that. So when you created these aliens, how do you go about doing that? Do you let nature inspire you, myths and lore, your nightmares? Like, what's the inspiration for the aliens as you create them?
Well, for the Tripod's Attack, I basically looked at what H.G. Wells had put together. And for him, the aliens, they're generically called the squids, but the aliens essentially are living brains that will plug themselves into different machines the way we will wear different sets of clothes. So that's kind of a nightmarish thing. But when you go, say, to Mars, the idea that Rice Burroughs had when he did Mr. John Carter, the idea then was that all the races on Mars essentially are humanoid in appearance, right down to having five-digit hands. I've often wondered, would he ever have drawn a connection that maybe there were humans that had gone to Mars, or maybe that the humans on Earth are descended from Mars? I like looking at, how could this have happened? Because just happening in nature seems really, really unlikely for a humanoid race to evolve on Mars. We may like, Deja Thoris is the chainmail bikini wearing wife of of John Carter and all that. Not likely going to happen in real life. So for me, yeah, some to a degree mythology, but I also looked a lot at, he mentions, what's his name, H.G. Wells mentioned not only the squid-like creatures who invade Earth, but he also mentioned a number of humanoid creatures who had been brought along in the squid's cylinders when they came to Earth, and they were essentially food for the Martian squids. So, in Where the Red Sands Fly, I talk about those guys. Those are kind of spindly fellows who do a lot of work on Mars. They are the native Martians. I really wanted to bring in a lot of other characters and aliens from C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. I'm surprised how many people don't know. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books, wrote a science fiction trilogy too that took place on Mars and Venus. But unfortunately, I found out the copyright has not run out on those, and C.S. Lewis's estate was not willing to give permission for me to use them in a book. So I had to sack those. But essentially looking at the characters, the kinds of aliens that were in those series over 100 years ago, I like to pull them in, and then I like to try and build bridges. Okay, how could these guys all have been on the same planet and not killed each other? And so I had a good time with that. Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. I imagine the C.S. Lewis's stuff will be close to the 100-year mark soon.
Yes, it will be.
Not so. That's interesting. That's obviously. clearly, this interview is winding down. We're at the 2-hour mark. But before I let you go, was there anything about the Tripod Attacks, which is the first book in the Young Chesterton Chronicles, that we didn't talk about that you want to let us know before we go?
Just that, I wrote it so that it would be the kind of adventure I would have liked to read when I was younger. And, it could be the homeschooling mom who's looking for something for her sons to actually enjoy. Don't give him Anne of Green Gables. Okay. That's child abuse. No, I'm teasing, but he won't like it. But this is something that I wrote it for a young person to enjoy. I did not write it to preach to anybody. I wrote it to write a good story. And the feedback I've gotten says that for many people, it is that good story. So pick it up, enjoy it, pay a few bucks, or just read it from a friend. But I just want you to enjoy the story, and I hope you do.
Okay. And this is a part of the introduction of the interview, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right books. So do your part. And a new author like John McNichol, could use it. And, obviously he's been, taking his time writing these. Life happens. We get it. But in the grander scheme of things, he's competing against people with a bazillion books out. So, help his book stand out. Leave a review if you read it and you enjoy it. So with that being said, John, can you tell listeners how they can find you on the wild interwebs? And as usual, it will be linked in the show notes.
Awesome. Well, the easiest way to get a hold of them is to go to my Amazon.com page. Please make sure that you get the editions that are done by my current publisher, Hillside. Okay. The ones from Sophia are out of print. The older version of The Emperor of North America has this cover on it. And while I do like the cover, the book is better if you get the one with the Emperor's headshot on it. So yes, go to Amazon.com. You'll find the Tripods Attack. You'll find the Emperor of North America. And soon you'll be finding Where the Red Sands Fly, all from Hillside Publishers.
All right. And you can find us, dear listener, at twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show, Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group where all the shenanigans happen over at Blasters and Blades Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/ Blasters and Blades Podcast. Again, /groups/ Blasters and Blades Podcast. If you're not sensing a theme there, we've got one. We have a Facebook page that just needs a few more likes so we can get a dedicated URL. So type into that little search bar, Blasters and Blades Podcast page, and find us and like and follow and do your part, people. We have a website where you can listen to us at anchor.fm /blasters tech and tech blades. Again, anchor.fm /blasters and blades. Ooh, tongue twister. Where for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help us keep the lights on, or you could support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com /author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts Doc Cisca and Nick Garber duly caffeinated. They will drink until their bladder explodes. And if they were here, they would tell you there ain't no quitters. And so with that being said, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the aforementioned Nick Garber and Doc Cisca, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thanks for stopping by, John. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, JR. I had a great time.